Hey, what's up, everybody? My name's Curtis Teel. I'm our Twinsburg, Macedonia campus minister. I'm glad to be here, hanging out with you virtually today. I especially want to say welcome to everybody, but especially those of you who maybe are joining us online, hanging out with us online. Today we are finishing out our Jesus Story series. And so I want you to grab your Bible and open it up to Mark chapter 4. If you're sitting out there in the audience, grab the Bibles at the end of the rows, pass them down. And if you don't have a Bible at home that you feel like you can read and understand, I would love for you to go ahead and take one of those paperback Bible home with you. We're going to be on page 815 when we get there here in a little bit. Now, one of the things I love most about major sports, about all the major sports, is the strategizing that goes on between the two different teams. And you've got both teams. It kind of becomes like a three-dimensional chess match where both teams are out there and they're constantly using strategy. They're constantly trying to outthink their opponent, outmaneuver their opponent. And the sport that I think this is most evident in is the sport of football. And the reason why I think it's the most evident in football is because of this thing that we call the audible. Now, what happens with an audible is the quarterback gets his play from the sideline. He gets the play from the coach, and then he goes into his team, and his team, the other 10 guys, huddle up around him, and he tells them, hey, this is the play that we're getting ready to run. And then they break, and they go out, and they sit down on the line of scrimmage. Now, the quarterback that was the best at making this happen was Peyton Manning. And he'd get down, and they'd sit down and they'd get ready to go, and the defense would do the same thing. The captain would get the play from the sideline. He'd go in, give it to the other 10 guys, and the two teams would line up on the line of scrimmage and get ready to run the play. Now, at this point in time, the quarterback's job is then to read the defense, to try and figure out what play that they are getting ready to run and whether or not, assess the situation as to whether or not they've got a good play to go up against the defense that they're facing. And the quarterback, Peyton Manning, has got all kinds of weapons in his arsenal to try and figure out what kind of defense they're in. He could send a man in motion. He's got what's called a hard snap count where they could fake that they're getting ready to start to see if they can get some guys to move, maybe a linebacker to jump so they can see that it's an all-out blitz. And if they're in a bad play, they can what's called audible out of it. But at that point in time, because they're lined up against the defense, they have to use language that nobody else understands. And so that's where Peyton Manning made famous his phrase. He'd get ready, he'd get set, and he'd go, Omaha, Omaha. And it meant something. He would talk in ways that only his fellow players, his teammates, would understand. Now, if an offense can audible out and change their play, so could the defense. And so after a while, people got used to Peyton Manning doing this and other quarterbacks doing it, and they would figure out ways to audible back into good plays against the offense's audibles. And so if the offense could audible, the defense could audible. And so that led to quarterbacks using fake audibles. And so there's all kinds of people now that love, or there's guys that used to play in the NFL that love to talk about the nonsensical things that Peyton Manning would say from the line of scrimmage at time. He'd get down and, Omaha! Your mother was a hamster. Your father was an elderberry. And it's like, oh, wait. Did he just check into a play that's called My Mother is a Hamster? Like, there's not really a play that's called My Mother is a Hamster, right? But they would have to treat it as if, well, that may actually be a play. And so they'd have to read him and try and assess what's going on. Now, here's the deal. When a quarterback would audible, the goal was not to find and run the perfect play for the situation. That wasn't the goal. The goal of an audible is to get into a better play for the situation. See, when the quarterback sits back and he reads and he understands what's going on, sometimes he sees, hey, we're in a bad play. And so they'll check out of that one and check into another play. And the goal is not to find the perfect play to run. The object is to try and find a better play for the situation that they're facing. Now, here's the deal. We audibled out of what we plan to talk about today to close out our Jesus Stories series. Well, we audibled out because we started sitting around, we gathered up as a teaching team, and we started looking at our Facebook feeds and some of the meetings that we're having with people individually, one-on-one, and we saw, man, there's just a better fit for the situations that our people are in, for our situations that many of us, if not all of us, are facing here this morning. And so we audibled out. And here's what I want you to see. As we go through this lesson this morning, I want you to see that there's something about following Jesus. There's something about following Jesus that Jesus was constantly trying to take his students and drive them to this place where they would live out their faith. He's trying constantly to get them to this place. And I want you to see what that is, because once we unearth it, once we kind of expose what this is, and then you go back and you read Jesus' stories, you're going to see this pop up over and over and over again as he's teaching his disciples, as he's teaching his students. So I want to show you this morning, and I hope that this will be something that sticks out to you and will mean something to you. So where we jump in Mark chapter 4, Jesus has been teaching large crowds all day. In fact, he's probably been going around, he's probably healed some people, and when he would teach, Jesus would teach with these things that we call parables. And a parable is just simply a story that has a spiritual point behind it. And he would use that to say, hey, you do know something about what it looks like to love God and love people, and here's why. And he would use a story that they would understand. So he's been teaching these large crowds all day, and he's been using these things called parables. He's been using stories. And after he would teach these really large crowds, if he ever took a break, it says that he would take a break and he would circle up with his specific 12 students, the guys he chose to like hang out with regularly, and teach them what it really, make sure that they understood what his message was, because one of these days he was going to hand it off to them. He made sure to circle up with them, and he would explain those parables in great detail. And then he would go back to teaching the large crowds, and then he'd kind of circle back up with his guys. And so this was just a go day for Jesus. And finally, where we're coming into the story today, evening's coming up. It's about time for everyone to go home. And then this is what happens next. Jesus is absolutely worn out because he's been teaching all day, and this is what happens next. Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35, it reads like this. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. And the disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He, Jesus, got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. And the wind died down, and it was completely calm. I think it's really interesting here that Jesus just tells the wind, just tells the waves to be quiet, be still. But then he tells the wind, he rebukes the wind. You know, I'd like to know what that sounds like. He just tells the waves, hey, like, quiet, be still. But then he tells, now you wind, I don't know what you think you're up against here. Well, you coming up in here while I'm trying to nap. Like, he rebukes him. I want to know what the rebuke would sound like. And then in verse 40, he says, he said to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And they were terrified and asked each other, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? So here's what happens. Here's kind of the story in a nutshell. Jesus finishes up. He's worn out, and he tells his disciples, he tells his students, he says, I want to go over to the other side of the lake. I want to go over to the other side of the sea. And so he hops in the boat. Now, it's very possible Jesus often would teach from the boat. And what it's pretty cool because he'd sit up in the boat and he'd use the sea at the background because he knew it would amplify his voice, and he'd use that to teach really large crowds. And so Jesus was in the boat as he finishes up, and he turns to his disciples, his students, and say, okay, I want to go over to the other side. He's worn out. He's just looking for some alone time, some just time by himself. And so they put out into the sea to go out to the other side of the boat, and Jesus goes back to the back of the boat, the stern of the boat, and he lays down on a cushion, and he begins to take a nap. Now, I got a picture I want to show you. This is the Sea of Galilee, and this is where they are at. This is where they're at. Now, the Sea of Galilee exists. It's you know, kind of specifications is it is 700 feet below sea level, and it's surrounded by mountainous territory. And so it's not uncommon for huge rushing winds to rush into the valley. That's, you know, because it's 700 feet below sea level. And then combine those big, gigantic winds along with the right humidity and the right temperature, it's nothing for a storm to come up out of nowhere. In fact, that's one of the things that the Sea of Galilee is known for these huge storms that would just brew and all of a sudden be on top of you, come up just out of nowhere because of, the way that it's surrounded by mountainous territory. In fact, even today, it's known for these big storms that could just come out of nowhere. So I want you to picture this scene. They're out there. They're on the Sea of Galilee. They're trying to go across to the other side. And waves are crashing and the ship's rocking back and forth. Now, we know of at least 4 of Jesus' disciples were professional fishermen. Professional fishermen. And they professionally fished on the Sea of Galilee. So they were not strangers to these huge storms that would just pop up out of nowhere. But this storm is so bad, the boat gets rocking, it gets going, that the 4 professional fishermen get worried. They run to the back of the boat to Jesus, and they wake Jesus, who is by trade a carpenter. 4 professional fishermen go and wake up a carpenter to do something about the storm because it had them so worked up. And I imagine him, as Jesus kind of wakes up in this situation, he's kind of, maybe he's a little disoriented because he's been napping. He can't understand, maybe everybody's talking to him at once because they're kind of frantic as the storm's going on. And Jesus turns and he tells it, shh, quiet. And the storm quiets. And Jesus looks back at him. He's, okay, now what were you guys saying? I wasn't able to understand you. Now that's the story that we're looking at today. And he asks them, why were you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And now, we've got to back up a little bit because as this conversation unfolded, there's a reason why. Because Jesus, at this point in time in this story, is trying to get his disciples to go to this place. He's trying to get them to that place that I was telling you about that I want you to see this morning as we unfold it. And to see that, we've got to rewind back a little bit. So go back with me. And when Jesus first starts hanging out with these guys, he's going around and he's teaching large crowds, and he becomes known as a teacher. And one of the things that's very common for this, at this point in time in history, was a teacher would go around and he would collect students. He would handpick students to follow him and study the things that he's teaching. It seems kind of odd for us now. It'd be odd for me to go around and handpick people. Hey, come follow me around and all. But for them, that's exactly, that's just kind of what they did. And so Jesus, as he started teaching, got to be known as a teacher, he went and he handpicked 12 guys that we call the apostles. And they're basically, it's like JC and the gang. It's like his crew that he's going to teach and then eventually hand off his message to, for them to go and tell other people of the things that God has done through him, through these apostles. Now, when Jesus would go and he was handpicking these guys, he'd say, hey, come follow me. And there's a couple things that we don't see Jesus tell people. We don't see him promise. We don't see him say, hey, this is like a benefit. There's a couple things that we don't see Jesus say when he says, hey, come follow me. And one of the things that we don't see Jesus say is, come follow me, I'll make you a better person. Although, I do think when you follow Jesus, you'll forgive quicker. I do think that you'll be more generous. You'll be more kind. You won't worry about some of the things that you used to worry about in the past. I do think that you will become a better person. In fact, some of the best people, most of the best people I know are followers of Jesus, although that's not Jesus' promise. Come follow me, I'll make you a better person. That's not a benefit. Jesus also doesn't go around saying a whole bunch, hey, come follow me, I'll get you to heaven. He doesn't teach about that near as much as we would think that Jesus specifically would teach about. Now, he does talk about the kingdom of God. He does talk about eternity and living out eternity in relationship with God. But heaven is not a benefit that we see specifically Jesus bringing up over and over and over again to his students. And the other thing that we don't really see Jesus say is Jesus doesn't say, hey, come follow me, and I'll give you a life that's pain-free, problem-free. In fact, that's not something Jesus teaches at all. And this is where it gets a little bit of a difficult truth for us to hear and for us to kind of wrestle with what it means to us. But stay with me. See, this message that come follow Jesus and he'll give you a life that's pain-free, problem-free. It seems it always tries to find its way. People always try and mix this in with the message of Jesus all of the time. But really, if we follow Jesus, that if you really want to follow Jesus, he'll take care of you and he'll make sure no bad things happen, that you're pain-free, problem-free. But that's not the message that Jesus delivers. In fact, I would go as far as to say anytime a person or someone says to you, if you do this thing, fill in the blank, whatever it is, if you do this, then God will always this, fill in the blank. I would say that's not Christianity, that's magic. Like if you say this certain prayer or hold your hand a certain way, that has nothing to do with following Jesus. That's magic. And Jesus didn't come to be your magician. Jesus didn't come say, hey, come follow me, and I will give you a life that's pain-free, problem-free. That's not something Jesus promised. And so he goes around and he starts collecting, starts getting these guys saying, hey, come follow me. What's the benefit? What's this place? What's this point that Jesus is trying to drive them to get them to understand so that they would live out their faith? There's something I want you to see about following Jesus. So we go back to Matthew chapter 10, in the beginning of Jesus' ministry, when he's handpicking these guys. And in Matthew chapter 10, when we start, Jesus has just handpicked his crew. I'll take you, I'll take you, I'll take you, you. And then they circle up. And in Matthew 10, he brings them aside, and he begins to have a conversation with them. And he starts telling them, these are the things that I'm going to have you do. He says, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to send you guys out. I'm going to send you out in pairs of 2. And I want you to go, and I want you to go teach the same message that I've been teaching. I want you to go teach the same message that I've been teaching. I want you to, here's where I want you to go. Here's what I want you to say. Here's who I want you to say it to. This is what you wear. This is how much money to take. He gives them all the specifics of what they need to go on this journey, that he's going to send them on this adventure. I'm going to enable you to do some of the same things, some of the same miracles that I've been doing. And then he surprises them. Because then in verse 16, he surprises them a little bit, and he tells them, hey, look, I'm going to send you out. You're going to be my witnesses, and people aren't going to like it. It says you're going to be taken, and you're going to be flogged. And the guys, like if I was sitting in there in the room with them, I'd be like, whoa, like flogged? Now see, flogging's like spanking on steroids. They'd take the shirt off, and they'd whip your back with a stick, and they'd wear this scar. So like anytime you go to the beach, you take your shirt off, somebody like, whoa, you did something wrong. Like, yeah. And so Jesus says, you're going to be my witnesses. I want you to go teach the same message that I've been teaching, and people aren't going to like it. Now, at this point in time, you totally catch them off guard, because if you remember, like right now, people can't get enough of them. They can't get away from Jesus. In the Mark 4 story, when they're going on the side of the boat, it says other boats go with them. And so people are like, Jesus is going to the other side of the boat. I'm getting my boat. And they hop in their boat, and they go across the other side. They can't get away from these large crowds. Jesus is constantly teaching these large crowds. So he says, so when he tells his disciples, when he tells his apostles, you're going to be handed over and you're going to be beaten, they're like, that doesn't make any sense. People can't get enough of us right now. And Jesus is peering into the future. He says, well, all that's going to change. All that's going to change. So he says 16, like you're going to be flogged. And then he gives us verse 19. And verse 19 is really where it catches them off guard, because he says this. Jesus says this to his apostles. He says, but when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say. Now, here's the deal. Go back to verse 19 for a second. If I'm sitting in the room with Jesus, and Jesus says, but when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say, I'd be like, good, Jesus. I got that one. Don't worry. If when I get arrested, I'm not going to worry about what to say, because my mouth is probably what got me into this mess in the first place. So I'm just going to keep my trap shut. In fact, I'm not going to be worried about this. I got that covered. But Jesus, what I am going to be worried about is this: the fact that I am arrested. Like, I'm not going to worry about what to say. I'm going to be worried about the fact that I have been arrested. And Jesus says, don't worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say. And then in verse 20, he says, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Now, once again, if I was standing in here, if I was in this, so let me get this straight. I'm going to be arrested, yes. And God is going to be present in all of this, including the trial, yes. And then he's going to give me what to say in the trial. And Jesus said, yes. Well, Jesus, if God is so involved in this, why doesn't God just, get me unarrested? Or how about, better yet, why does he let this happen at all? And I would say, Jesus, I know you're telling me to have confidence and all because God is involved, but that's not exactly what I would like God to be like. And so Jesus goes on teaching for a while through the rest of that chapter, and he goes on telling exactly what's going to happen to them, and then he reveals it. He finally tips the hand of this place where he's trying to take us all to, where he's trying to get his disciples to, where he's trying to get us to so we can live out our faith, what it looks like and why we would follow Jesus. He lists out all of these bad things that are going to happen, and then he says this. He says, do not be afraid. 3 times, in fact. 3 times in just that short little section of teaching in the rest of chapter 10, he says, do not be afraid. But wait, Jesus, wait. I'm going to be arrested? Yes. And do not be afraid. But we're going to be flogged? Yes. And when you are, do not be afraid. And then in Matthew 10:28, he says probably what I think is one of the most difficult verses where we still wrestle with and try and figure out how to apply to ourselves. And he says this to them, and he says, do not be afraid of those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. See, this is one of the most difficult things for us, and it's a process, and there's good news for us. Because Jesus' apostles, the guys that he hung out with, the guys that Jesus hung out with the most, teaching the most, they did not get this until right before the very end. This was an ongoing process for them. And it's an ongoing process for us. You see, Jesus wants to take his followers to a place where their faith in God is so big, where they are so secure in God's love that even in the midst of circumstances where it feels like we are totally out of control and there is little hope, and perhaps maybe God has forgotten all about us altogether, we hear this promise from God, fear not, I am with you. You see, Jesus' message was not, believe in me and I'll give you a life that's pain-free, problem-free. Jesus' message was not, believe in me and I won't let bad things happen. Jesus' message was, believe in me and don't be afraid when bad things happen. If you believe in me, you won't have to be afraid when bad things happen. So why would Jesus need them to grasp this message? Why would this be the place that Jesus comes back to over and over and over again in his teaching? Is Jesus saying, chill out, man. Everything's going to be okay. I don't know why you're freaking out right now. No, that doesn't seem to be his message. It's too trite. Jesus, is he saying, it's fine. What are you so afraid of? No, Jesus always seems to respond with compassion. In fact, let's jump back into the storm story because there's where we really see how one of these conversations would unfold. So let's jump back into the storm story now, Mark chapter 4. And so Jesus is super worn out. He's been teaching all day, and he says, hey, let's go over to the other side of the boat. A storm arises out of nowhere, and it begins overwhelming the boat. Waves are crashing in. The boat's nearly swamped. And all the while, Jesus is in the stern. Jesus is in the back of the boat, sleeping on a pillow, and I don't know how but it's kind of one of those things where I picture him kind of like really hold up with the pillow. Maybe he's got the whole thing, he's got a body pillow going on, maybe he's sucking his thumb. It's like, man, nothing is getting in the way of him and this nap. And this storm comes in, it's rocking him back and forth, the waves come in, and the apostles run and they wake him up. And I'd love to know how they gathered around them. Was it just one guy or 2 guys that go get him? Was it all of them that were in the boat? And you imagine the situation, and I love the question that they ask Jesus as they run to him and they wake him up. And they say, teacher, don't you care if we drown? And what's really cool about this is the Greek would emphasize things. They didn't have bold and italics like we do in our print. And so the way they would emphasize something was they would repeat it more than once. And so literally what that verse in Mark chapter 4 says is, teacher, don't you care that we are perishing to death? Don't you care that we drown? Don't you care that we are perishing to death? And here's what I think is interesting about that question. That question probably sounds a little familiar because we have our own version of that question, right? God, don't you care? God, don't you care that I can't pay my bills right now? God, don't you care that I'm still single? God, don't you care that I'm in debt up to my eyeballs, and no matter how much I work and how many jobs I take on, I just can't seem to get myself out of it? God, don't you care that I'm afraid for my black son's safety? God, don't you care that my mom is sick? God, don't you care that I feel threatened by how our new president sees people like me? God, don't you care? While the storm's rocking on. And Jesus gets up, talks to the storm first, and he tells it, knock it off. Shh, quiet, hush. And the storm quits. And Jesus turns back, and turns to his disciples, and he says, why are you so afraid? Now, once again, if I was in this situation, my response to Jesus would be like, well, Jesus, I don't know if you were paying attention or not. I know you were sleeping, but just a second ago, there was a huge storm. I'd get really animated when I tell. There's like winds rushing around. There's waves crashing in the boat. And you were in the back napping on a pillow. What do you mean? Why? And he'd say, no. That's how I pictured the conversation. I said, no. Not what were you afraid of? Why were you so afraid? Do you still not know that God cares about you? You see at the end of that Matthew chapter 10, Jesus tells them when he says, do not be afraid, he says, don't you know that the very hairs on your head are numbered? And Jesus knows you personally. And he said, I tell you this, can't you, and he's talking and he's teaching to him, he said, don't you know that you can buy many sparrows? You can buy several sparrows for a couple pennies, right? And they're like, yeah. And he said, well, I'll tell you this, not a single sparrow falls to the ground dead without your heavenly Father knowing about it. And I'll tell you this, you personally are worth more than many sparrows. Jesus knows your name. He says, why are you so afraid? Do you still not know that God cares about you? And we don't have their answer recorded. We don't have that they even tried to respond to Jesus' question when they asked, why were you so afraid? But my guess is their answer would be very similar to mine. If Jesus said, why were you so afraid? It'd have to be, well, I forgot who you are. And that you were sitting right here in the boat with me the whole time. I forgot that you were right here with me. See, he closes out verse 41 in Mark chapter 4, and it says that they were terrified, and they asked each other, who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him? And the Greek's funny here. It points out something extra. It says, when it says they were terrified here, it literally says that they feared a great fear. And so if their fear of the storm was at a 7, the fear of the storm was like, crank it to 11, man. It was up there. They feared a great fear. Why do they fear a great fear? I think because in that one little moment, they got a glimpse of how big and how powerful God is. And they realized, he's right here in the boat with me. So then if you go through and you read these stories of Jesus' teaching and his students, you'll see this lesson. Do not be afraid. Fear not. I am with you. Fear not. I am with you. Pop up over and over and over again. But why? And I think it's because having an overwhelming faith is what allows us to what frees us to love others. An overwhelming faith frees us to love other people. See, this is the kind of faith, this is the only kind of faith that will allow you to forgive an ex-husband or an ex-wife who has deeply, deeply hurt you. This is the only kind of faith that would allow you to forgive a wrong in the past of a friendship or a relationship. This is the only kind of faith that would allow you to step out of your comfort zone and care for someone who doesn't look like you, even though everything around you tells you that you shouldn't. This is the only kind of faith that would allow you to step up and stand up for someone being picked on or mistreated by a group of people. Because you're not afraid of what loving them might mean. You're not afraid of what standing up against the wrongs of others might mean. Because you have a faith that overwhelms your fears. Instead of the other way around. Instead of fears that could overwhelm your faith. You see, this is a whole lot easier said than done, though. Man, I'm not there at all. I'm not even close. And that's why I'm so encouraged that for Jesus and his specific students, his 12 apostles, this was an ongoing process for them because I'm not there. But here's something that I am beginning to realize. My 3 daughters, they're going to take their cues from me. You see, a lot of this has to do with what we're listening to, who we're taking our cues from. You see, for Thanksgiving, a tradition that we usually have since I was a little boy, I would used to go to I'd go to my grandma's farm. My parents would drive me halfway, and one of my uncles would pick me up and drive me the rest of the way to my grandma's farm in West Virginia, and we go to this thing that we call deer camp. And out at my grandma's farm, there's no electricity, there's no cell service, there's no public water. In fact, we do have water in the house, but it's from a spring that's out in the backyard where they literally take like a pipe, it's just shoved in the ground, and gravity feeds it to the house. And it's pretty cool. I love going out there and not being able to be reached by anybody. But as a little kid, it was kind of scary, you know. I was out there with just my uncles. I'm supposed to be big, bad, tough kid at deer camp. And one night, because the sun gets dark, because it gets dark at like 4:30 now, in November, during Thanksgiving, we'd go out there, and so we'd sit around and we'd just talk. We'd just talk a bunch, and I'd really just listen to my uncles talk. And my uncle started talking about like the end of the world and stuff, and I got real curious what they were talking about. And now, see, my uncles are not followers of Jesus. They do not have a relationship with God that I know about at all. And so they started talking about it, and I started getting inquisitive. As an 8-year-old boy, I'm kind of like trying to figure, what all's going on. And then I hear them reference the Bible, and I ask them, specifically what they're talking about. And they're talking about something out of the book of Revelation that's referred to as the mark of the beast. And it was pretty, like, kind of scary stuff. But, as an 8-year-old kid, I knew, I was like, well, I'm supposed to trust the Bible. And so I run and I find a Bible that's in, like, one of the little nightstands. And I pull it out and I find where it is and I start reading it. And it freaks me out as a kid. Now, what you need to know about the book of Revelation is it just uses a bunch of imagery to try and explain things that they couldn't necessarily understand at the time. It's like dreams that they're essentially having. And they're writing, this guy named John's writing them down. And so he writes down this thing, mark of the beast, and I sit down and I start reading it, and it talks about how a beast is going to come over and it's going to take over the land, and there's going to be a dragon that rises up out of the sea, and it's got 7 heads. And I start to freak out as a kid. I can't get a hold of anybody. I can't call my parents. I can't ask my uncles because they don't really know anything about the Bible. And I start freaking out. For days, I can't sleep because I'm afraid I'm going to go to sleep, and the next morning I'm going to wake up, there's going to be a dragon that's come out of the sea, and it's going to eat in the whole world, and I'm not going to know about it because I'm going to be stuck in the middle of nowhere. Now, that's not at all what happens in the Bible, but that's where my 8-year-old mind ran with it. And so as soon as we got back to civilization and I was able to make a phone call, I called my dad because I hadn't slept for like 3 days because I'm worried about this thing. I called my dad and I asked him, what's going on about this. And my dad explains to me that it's all just imagery. He told me it's probably just imagery. It's not actually going to be a literal dragon that rises out of the sea. Like, you're okay. And he gives me several verses to read and reminds me, hey, God's with you. Like, you're going to be okay. And so he kind of talks to me about that. I still go to sleep from time to time wondering if there's going to be a dragon come out of the sea the next morning. But that's not the point. You see, what I realize now looking back on that is it makes a big difference on who we listen to, right? It makes a huge difference who we listen to. See, I was taking my cues as an 8-year-old boy at Thanksgiving from my uncles and my aunts who don't, as far as I know, have any relationship with Jesus. And as they were talking about this, they were afraid. Now, they wouldn't admit that. They wouldn't admit, but fear was driving that conversation that they were having that night. And so I bred into that fear because that's what I was listening to. See, as Christians, and if you're not a follower of Jesus, if you're not a Christian sitting in the audience, this is where Jesus wants to take you. He wants to take you to this point. But as Christians, we need to be people that provide stability in a very unstable society that has so much driven by fear. But we don't need to fear the ones who can harm the body. You see, we need to keep moving in the direction of having a faith in God that's so overwhelming that even in circumstances where we should be terrified, that we can understand and maybe hear God whisper, "Fear not, I'm here with you. Fear not, I'm here with you." Now I found a clip of a guy named Ernie Johnson. You see, one of the reasons why we audibled here to what we're talking about today is I saw so many things on Facebook kind of coming through about people just in angst. And then after the election, but not just after the election, this holiday season that we're in, having to deal with family and have those conversations, marriage problems going on, financial problems going on. And I came across this clip that aired on national TV from a guy named Ernie Johnson as he's commentating on basketball. And so I just want to play it for you here this morning, and I'll be back to close it out here in a second.
When this campaign season started, I felt like I'd been dealt a bad hand. I had these couple of choices. And there were trust issues with Hillary Clinton I couldn't get past. And there was this inflammatory rhetoric from Donald Trump, which to me was incomprehensible and indefensible. I couldn't vote for either one. For the first time in going to the polls for 42 years, I hit the write-in button, and I voted for John Kasich. And I left knowing that John Kasich wasn't going to win, but I left with a clear conscience because I hadn't settled. Number two, I'm hopeful. I watched the video today at CNN on what was going on at the White House with Donald Trump, President Obama. I was hopeful and I was encouraged that there will be a difference between the President Trump and the campaigning Trump. And I'm with these guys. We have to give them a chance. But here's the deal. I just hope that he's all in fixing the wounds in this country and the divides that separate this country. And I want to be part of that too. And for me to be part of it, I have to look in the mirror and I have to say, how am I going to be a better man? How am I going to be a better neighbor? How am I going to be a better citizen? How am I going to be a better American? How can I be a fountain and not a drain? And number three, I know you're not supposed to talk about politics and religion, but we're already talking about politics, and so I'm going to go the R direction too. I never know from one election to the next who's going to be in the Oval Office, but I always know who's on the throne. And I'm on this earth because God created me, and that's who I answer to. I'm a Christian. I follow this guy named Jesus. You might have heard of him. And the greatest commandment he gave me was to love others. And Scripture also tells us to pray for our leaders. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pray for Donald Trump. I'm going to pray for all those people right now who feel like they're on the outside looking in, who are afraid at this point. Pray for them too. In short, I'm praying for America. And I'm praying that one day we're going to look back and we're going to say, you know what? That Donald Trump presidency, that was all right. But I'm praying.
Yeah, that's powerful stuff right there. You just don't see things like that on national TV anymore. But I love his message. Man, how can I be a fountain and not a drain? You know, I don't know what storms you're facing right now. But I want you to hear something from me this morning. At Momentum, we want to be in the boat with you. None of us are at a place where we don't have fear, but together we can encourage each other to stay focused on God and that God is with us, that God is walking through this storm with us. And many of you can attest to that. Many of you showed up when alcoholism was the storm in your life, and we walked with you through it, and that storm is beginning to calm. You showed up broken from an affair and a marriage, and that storm is beginning to calm. You showed up through money, infertility, death in the family. Family disowned you because of your beliefs. And so we embrace first here, and slowly that storm is calming. You see, at Momentum, we don't want to just talk about being a safe place. We want to show you. We want you to see that and feel that. We want you to be a part of that. We want to be a bridge to the LGBT community and show you a God that desperately loves you. We want to be a bridge to help our world of the brokenness that is racism and xenophobia. We want to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. I mean, we want to be in the boat with you, and that's why you hear us so often tell you you've got to get into a Mo group, these groups of people that meet in someone's home on a night throughout the week. Not only because that's where you're going to grow in your relationship with God, but because that's where we can make friends with each other and we can bond together and we can face storms of life together so you feel like there's someone in the boat with you. We want to face whatever storm it is that you are going through together. And together we can help remind and remember that God is with us. Fear not. I'm here with you. You see, when I came back from my grandma's farm, my dad read me several different verses, and now I went back that following year, and it was kind of like one of those, I need to make a decision. Like, I'm afraid to go back because of how afraid I got the last time I was there, and my dad gave me a bunch of these like verses, to help me, remember these things. And one of them was this. It was Psalm chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. And I remember it because of something I'm getting ready to tell you here in a second. It says, Psalm 8, the guy says of God, when I consider your heavens, God, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place. What is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. It talks about stars set in place. Man, and out there on my grandma's farm, there is nobody for miles. And our coolers, because there's always snow on the ground, our coolers are just the snowbanks outside. And so we keep sodas and the beer and stuff. And I was, hanging out. My uncle told me, hey, Curtis, go grab me a beer. And so I went outside, and I'm digging through the snow. I can't find anything. My hands are freezing. And I just kind of paused, and I just let out this big sigh, and I look up, and I'm just overwhelmed. Because I look up, and the stars, they seem so close that night. I can picture it. As a 9-year-old boy, I can picture what I was wearing. I can picture exactly where I was standing and remembering this point of seeing all of these stars. It didn't look like you could look in half an inch in any direction and not see a star. And I was so overwhelmed. And in that moment, I remembered this verse. And in that moment, I felt like I got a glimpse of how big God is. And I felt like he was right there with me in that moment. And so my grandma's farm's kind of now become this place, this spiritual place for me where I go and I feel close to God. And I got this glimpse of how big God is. And it's like I could feel him say, I remember that moment. And it's like I could feel him say, fear not. I'm with you. And so the band's going to come up and they're going to lead us in a new song this morning that I think really spells out exactly what we're talking about here. They're going to lead us in a new song, and it talks about how God, if you can calm the raging seas, then you can calm whatever storm I'm facing. God, if you can set and hold the stars in place, I know you're with me. And so I hope that whatever storm you feel like you're facing, that this morning you can hear God say, fear not. I am with you. Let's pray. God, we love you. God, thanks for loving us. God, thanks for giving us this reminder over and over and over again about how we don't have to be afraid, that you're here with us. So God, with whatever storms people feel like they are facing this morning, from political things to personal things to things that have to do with their job, God, I pray that you will help them feel that you are right there with them so that they do not have to fear. And God, that they will have an overwhelming faith so that could free them to love other people. God, we love you. It's in your Son's holy and awesome name we pray. Amen.